Hey everyone, I'm back after about a year of not recording videos. I've been struggling to come up with topics of which I could cover in enough depth and enough detail to warrant a full video. I've had a few ideas, but they're still very early on and finding motivation has been difficult. Because of all of that, I decided that perhaps I should try taking a different angle, at least for now, of more of a Q&A style. So I've gone ahead and collected a number of questions from some of my friends to make a video to cover a bunch of different things a little more quickly. And of course, I hope that some of these questions that I collect over time I can make full-length videos on, or any of these topics that I pick up on you guys might want to learn more about, and then I could spend the time to do that. So, without further ado, let's get started. All right, so question one. I've heard the Stuka was one of the few, if not only, planes that could sustain a 90-degree dive. Is this true? All right, so from the research that I've done, I think I've found where this question originates from, based on the account of Eric Winkle-Brown, a British test pilot and the commanding officer of the number 1426 flight, the Royal Air Force, which was responsible for flying and testing captured enemy aircraft. So, this pilot said on the account of the Stuka that I had flown a lot of dive bombers, and it's the only one that you can dive truly vertically. Sometimes with the dive bombers, maximum dive is usually in the order of 60 degrees. When flying the Stuka, because it's all automatic, you are really flying vertically. The Stuka was in a class of its own. For some context, the Stuka had an automated pull-out system which would initiate a 6G pull-out maneuver once the bomb had been released, retracting the air brakes and throttling the engine up once the plane was angled into a shallow climb. This was a rather unique feature for the time, although some pilots disliked it, and many pilots in other countries managed comparable pullouts without this sort of assistance on the regular. I did some reading on other contemporary dive bombers to see how they compared. The Fairey Swordfish is on this list, as surprising as that might be, and it was trialed with some dives at up to 70 degrees, which I found rather surprising as, one, it's a biplane, and two, it's covered in fabric. Another plane I looked at, the A-36 Apache, although I've heard that it was mostly called the Mustang during the war, but anyway, it was rather accident-prone during training, so the airplane ended up being limited to a 70-degree dive to mitigate this risk. Another aircraft, the Vultee Vengeance, which I wouldn't fault you for never having heard of, had a wing with zero angle of incidence, which meant it could make vertical dives with essentially no corrective control inputs. It would just fall straight down. Well, this was great for dives, but it was a bit of a pain when it wasn't falling from the sky, as it meant the plane needed to hold a distinctly nose-up attitude in level flight, which was especially exaggerated on landing. I'm really glad I don't have to fly this plane. Okay, now before people start cracking out pitchforks and torches, I did look at the SBD Dauntless. The Dauntless could dive at up to around 80 degrees, but usually would dive at closer to 70. 4G pullouts at around 2,000 feet were considered typical, but at least some pilots, from the accounts that I've read, would more frequently yank up to 9Gs in an attempt to stay further away from the targets they were trying to bomb, as if you pulled harder right when you drop at 2,000 feet, the minimum altitude you'll end up at would be higher, keeping you away from all those angry guns. So, in conclusion for that question, it does seem like the Stuka was pretty much the only, at least widely used dive bomber that could do those sorts of maneuvers at 90 degrees and be completely fine. The automated system definitely helped with that, but I'm not sure I would say that it made the aircraft miles better than its contemporaries. It was definitely a foot up in some regards, but it wasn't a make or break sort of feature. All right, on to the next question. So, what was the tank with the largest gun? What was the heaviest tank? What are some really cool planes that never saw action? Okay, this is going to be a pretty long answer because this is a multi-part question, so let's get started. If we go by the conventional definition for a tank, the tank with the largest gun is the experimental British FV4005. The gun in question, the Ordnance quick-firing 183mm tank L4 gun, was developed as a way to defeat the perceived Soviet heavy tank menace. The Western Allies saw the IS-3 in 1945 and feared that the next war would feature such tanks in the thousands. The British wanted to mount this gun on a proper tank, but decided to develop a stopgap platform based on the Centurion's chassis. This would come to be the FV4005, which could be put into production should a war break out before its replacement was ready. This tank was restricted to firing its gun in a roughly 45-degree arc in front and to the rear, as the gun's massive recoil, 86 tons of force, threatened to damage the vehicle otherwise. The turret is essentially just a giant steel box, which is only 14 millimeters thick to keep out small arms fire and fragmentation. Only 3 of these were ever built, the first of which had a bare gun mount which couldn't even elevate the gun, just for testing purposes. Of course, this tank never went into production. One still exists near the Bovington Tank Museum as a gate guard. Now, for the heaviest tank to actually be built is the German Panzer VIII Maus. A funny name for such a large vehicle. Although only one was ever really completed, and this vehicle clocked in at about 180 tons, and it couldn't use most bridges and would have had to drive across the bottoms of rivers using a snorkel for the crew to, be able to breathe, and it would have needed to be connected to another Maus by electrical cable in order to power the Maus as it drove under the water. Now, you might be thinking, most tanks use gas. Why would an electrical cable help you move? So this tank suffered from the Ferdinand Porsche syndrome, which means that it had this magical little thing called the petrol-electric drive, which on paper might sound good, but in practice never really worked for Germany. The concept is you have a standard gas or diesel engine, which then drives an electric generator. You then run the power made by that generator to motors that drive the sprockets that move the tank. So the problem with this is it takes up a lot of space. It uses a ton of copper, which was a strategic resource that Germany didn't have a ton of, and it's heavy, which didn't help the tank, as the vehicle already had an obscene amount of armor protection, like from about 7.5 inches, which is 190 millimeters, on the sides and back of the hull, to 250 millimeters. That's 9.8 inches for the gun mantlet. And mind you, that mantlet was in front of the turret front armor, which was even more. It's absolutely absurd. The tank also mounted a 128 millimeter anti-tank gun, and because this wasn't enough, they slapped a 75 millimeter anti-tank gun coaxially with it, and a 7.92 millimeter MG34, because who doesn't want more gun? This tank never saw production. It never was really practical. While it was essentially impervious to any anti-tank weapons that the Allies had on the ground, artillery strikes could have dealt with it most likely. Airstrikes could have dealt with it. Its own maintenance issues would have made it a nightmare to keep going, and especially because Germany was on the retreat by the time this tank was even built. The fact that a mobility kill, the tank can't move anymore, that would have spelled doom for it because Germany would have needed to move the tank and repair it. But if your front line is always falling back, that can be very difficult. Okay. It's a ridiculous tank. It's so stupid. There's only one that still exists. I believe it's the hull. Yeah, it's the hull of the V1 prototype with the turret from the V2 prototype that the Soviets slapped together and then hauled back to Russia, where it still exists today. This question. Some really interesting aircraft that never saw action, huh? Okay, well, one that comes to mind is the P-6M Seamaster, which is a jet, flying boat, nuclear bomber. Not a grouping of descriptors I thought I'd ever see go together, but here you are. So, imagine you're the United States Navy, and nuclear bombs have just been invented. You're in a bit of a conundrum. These newly developed nuclear weapons happen to be, well, rather heavy. For some context, U.S. naval aircraft at the time usually were single-engine. Some were two-engine. But the B-29, the plane that carried the first nuclear weapons, was a massive four-engine bomber. In fact, the largest four-engine bomber to be built up to that point. So you're stuck in a bit of a spot because aircraft carriers aren't exactly huge. They were getting bigger, but not at a rate that gave the Navy very much confidence in their ability to make a plane that could carry a bomb of that size. So that left them with the option of a flying boat. And that is how the P-6M Seamaster came into being. The plane was supposed to carry nuclear weapons at very high speed for the time, up to Mach 0.9, very close to the speed of sound, and to be able to strike at relatively long range, operate with, the fleets at the time, while not needing an extremely large carrier to manage it. So there were a number of issues the plane had, with some of them ranging from stability issues. Multiple prototypes ended up crashing, and also the bomb bay was designed as such so that the doors were in the belly, which happened to be the boat part of the flying boat. Mixing large opening doors with water tends to result in leaks, so that required some fixing, but the plane was beginning to turn out, although with quite a price tag exceeding its projected costs and budget overruns galore. So, as painful as it is, aircraft was so close to actually entering service. It was getting its run-ups to starting operational service right around the time that the project was canceled in favor of, well, ballistic missiles being carried by submarines. And if this weren't enough, nuclear weapons were getting smaller and larger nuclear aircraft carriers, as in powered by nuclear reactors, were coming along. So the problem would be solved either way, and the Seamaster, as a very cool airplane, never got to see service. Oh, okay. This one's a fun question. What's your favorite plane and tank? Favorite plane is the F-6F Hellcat, hands down, no question about it. Perfect plane for the situation it found itself in. It was a complete improvement over the F-4F Wildcat. It was plenty good enough to deal with Zeros and other similar Japanese aircraft that were around at the time. It was easy to use from a pilot's perspective. It was a rugged plane. It had pilot armor. Radial engine meant it was tough. It could take bullets and keep on chugging. It was rather fast. It had a decently good climb rate, good high altitude performance for the Pacific. And it had rather good turning capabilities, as it had, I believe it's the largest wing area out of any single-engine fighter of World War II. It's just a good plane. I've liked it since I was little. I love seeing it in tricolor camouflage schemes. It's just a cool plane. Okay, favorite tank. This one is definitely not as quick for me to think of. I suppose if I had a gun to my head, and I had to choose, it would be the, excuse mouthful, M4A3 76W HVSS Sherman. I've also heard it called the M4A3E8, the Easy 8. I'm not sure if that was the actual designation or if that was just the experimental. I'm not sure, but it's a cool tank. It represents, in my opinion, like the pinnacle of the design of the Sherman. You've got the 76 millimeter gun, which gave it enough punch for it to be competitive against things like the Panther. It had the wider tracks, which helped with ground pressure issues, and it was just a good tank. I just liked Shermans in general already, so I had to pick one. It'd probably be that. Maybe the jumbo with the 76. That's also a good version. Um, and the M26 Pershing, even though it was kind of a dumpster fire, I just liked the tank. All right, that's only three questions, but two of those were multi-parters, so I'm gonna pretend like that was more. But we're looking like about 15 minutes. I feel like that's a good video length, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any topics you'd like me to cover, any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comments. Of course, any of the topics that I have covered in this video, if you want to see more on, then just tell me. Well, thanks for watching. Bye.